Hi, everybody. My name is Rabbi Scott Kalmakoff. I'm the coordinator for the Union for Traditional Judaism. It is a pleasure to be with you this evening. Thank you all for being here. We are recording this session, so if you don't want to be recorded, please feel free to turn off your camera. But it's always great to see your faces, so we feel like we're in the same room together and we're speaking to other human beings. Thank you so much for being here this evening. I would like to start off by giving a tremendous thank you to our sponsors of this evening's program, to our partners, Rabbi Gerald Sussman and Benita Nathan Sussman, in celebration of their 13-year-old granddaughter, Bina Sussman's acceptance into a high-level ballet program for 18-year-olds in Israel. So a 13-year-old and an 18-year-old program, pretty good. Thank you to our supporter, Mr. Alan Blyer, in memory of Margie B. Blyer. And thank you to our friends, Sharon Dresbach in memory of Usher Ben Israel, Rabbi Noah Gradovsky in honor of his longtime friendship with Stephen Sachs, and Rabbi Sachs's wonderful online dress show during the pandemic. Thank you to Rabbi Bernie Rotman for sponsoring tonight. And finally, thank you to Emmanuel Manny Sachs, who is sponsoring in honor of better things to come. We appreciate your support. I also just want to mention, before we get started, before we start with the official program, we have another program coming up in a few weeks. It's the last part of a three-part series called Masorah and Machloket, exploring the development, Machloket and Masorah, exploring the development of Machloket, debate within Jewish tradition. So here is the registration link for that if you would like to register. And also, we are currently sponsoring a UTJ membership campaign. So for those of you who might be interested in joining UTJ for $57.82, here is the link for that as well. We appreciate all of your support. Now, before we get started, we're going to do the official introduction to introduce Rabbi Sachs. And to introduce Rabbi Sachs, I call on Rabbi Gerald Sussman, who has been with UTJ from its founding and currently serves as the organization's executive vice president.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Well, we are very excited and proud to have Rabbi Sachs on this program, and especially because of all of his classes and lectures that he has given in the recent past. He received his smicha, his rabbinic organization, in August 2006 from Kolel Eshel Avraham in Spring Valley, and currently serves as the full-time spiritual leader of Adas Kodesh Shel Emet congregation in Wilmington, Delaware. Since coming to Adas Kodesh Shel Emes, Rabbi Sachs has served as the head of the Delaware Association of Rabbis and Cantors and heads the Vad HaKashrus of Delaware. He is the rabbinic head of the Chevra Kadisha, the Burial Society, and is active in communal organizations such as the Siegel Jewish Community Center of Delaware and Albert Einstein Academy, the local Jewish day school. Rabbi Sachs also serves as the secretary and treasurer of Morashah, the Rabbinic Fellowship of the Union for Traditional Judaism. And we are very honored and delighted this evening to welcome Rabbi Sachs.
Well, thank you very much,
And Rabbi. I'm sorry, Rabbi Sachs, we also have to thank all the individuals and families who are here tonight from your synagogue. Thank you to everybody for being here this evening. Wilmington represent.
Wilmington in the house, shall we say.
That's right. That's right.
Okay.
Thank you for being here.
Okay, great. So thank you for joining me, everyone. Thank you, Rabbi Sussman and Rabbi Kalmakoff, for nice greetings and introductions. So when I was first asked to do this, actually, I thought it was a misunderstanding. I thought I was one of a series of rabbis who'd be speaking about some high holiday thoughts. And then only later on, a couple of weeks ago, did I come to realize when I saw the flyer that I was actually basically the speaker. So what I'd like to do in light of that is I'm first going to go with the advertised topic, which is Jewish views dealing with life after death and the afterlife. And then if we still have time after that, I want to talk about some of the other I'm not going to read you my sermons or deliver the sermons, but talk about maybe the Torah Shabbal Peh behind the sermons. In other words, what was going on in my mind that really got me to talk about this a little behind the scenes. So the first thing I wanted to talk about, as I said, and this is going to be my Kol Nidre talk, which is really meant as a setup for the Yiska talk the next day. but his Jewish views regarding the afterlife and life after death. So this has always particularly fascinated me for a couple reasons. One of the reasons is because I think on a very base level, one of the things that attracts people to religion is it gives us at least some sort of window into what we believe in this next world will look like. To put a little more bluntly, maybe death anxiety. It helps us deal with some of those issues. There's only one strange thing about that, and that is, of course, if you look at the Torah itself, and here I'm talking about the Hamishei Chumshei Torah, the 5 books of Moses here, it says almost nothing about life after death in the Torah. We have a reference here and there to Sheol, which is some sort of netherworld where the dead spirits go. People go to live with their forefathers afterwards, after their life here ends, but we're really not told very much about what this afterworld is going to look like. So it becomes a little more defined. One of the more interesting segments is that if you remember when the Shaul, the king of Israel, is having an issue, he's having an issue trying to get in touch with God before he goes into battle against the Philistines. God isn't speaking to him anymore. God is angry with him because he hasn't obeyed God's commands. So he winds up going to the witch of Endor. And that's where Return of the Jedi, they got the moon of Endor. This is where it comes from. He goes to the witch of Endor, and her job is basically to call upon dead spirits. So he says to me, do me a favor, call up Shmuel, the prophet Samuel. And Saul is in disguise, so she doesn't even recognize who the guy is. And she says to him, the king has said it's illegal. This is illegal under halacha, Jewish law, to try to call up deceased spirits. And then she looks at him and says, wait a minute. I think you are the king. You are the king. So of course she goes and she conjures up Shmuel, his soul from Shaul. And what does he say to what does Shmuel say? Samuel say to Saul? He basically says, "I was having a good schluff down there. Why are you bothering me?" And Shaul is not satisfied with that. So Shaul says, "Well, you have to tell me what's going to happen here. I'm about to go into battle against the police team, the Philistines. What's going to happen?" And basically Shmuel says, look, it's not going to end out well for you. I gave you the same answer I told you when I was in the land of the living. So this is basically what we have in the Tanakh as far as Jewish attitudes towards life after death go. However, Judaism really has to catch up in a certain sense. If you look at other religions of the time in contemporary time periods, they really had a much more developed theology about life after death and what the afterworld would look like. So this really starts to develop a lot more, particularly during the Maccabean or Hasmonean revolt against the Greeks. What happens here is Jews see that they're suffering. The Jews who are fighting at least a hyper-Hellenization of the Greeks, like the Maccabees and the Hasidim and their followers. When I say Hasidim, I don't mean guys in Brooklyn with big black hats or anything like that. I simply mean people who are pious. They weren't doing well. They were suffering. However, the Jews who bought into this full Hellenization program were doing very well. So you really have this idea emerge that those who are loyal, keep the faith, if they're not rewarded in this world, will at least be rewarded in the next world. And if you flip that around, those who are willing to cash in on this world, live a hyper-Hellenized lifestyle, may do well in this world, but in the next world, in some sense or other, they're not going to do really well. So this is the beginnings, at least, of Judaism, of this idea of Techiyat HaMetim, a resurrection of the dead. And this isn't about the year, this is really 168, most scholars date this to. And what they're really arguing is here is we have some of these ideas which appear, let's say, in the book of Daniel, which are placed historically much earlier. And let's say right after the first temple is destroyed or so, first temple is destroyed 586 BCE, but they really start to develop more right about the time of 168 BCE to really basically say it's tough, maybe tough to be a Jew in this world, but if you're faithful, you'll be rewarded in the next world. Interestingly enough, when a potential convert comes before the Bet Din to convert to Judaism, you're also supposed to say basically that. There's a bunch of things you say, but one of the things you're supposed to say is, look, it's tough to be a Jew in this world, but if you still want to join the Jewish people, eventually there'll be a reward. Of course, this type of theology has been heavily criticized by people like Karl Marx, let's say, who say this is something that's always dangled before the masses. This, if you live a good life in this world and basically you play by the rules and don't rock the boat too much, then in the next world, God will give you your due, as a way of basically placating people so they don't revolt against the social order. So we have this idea of life after death, and then interestingly enough, what happens is it becomes conflated with a messianic era. This idea of a Mashiach coming. Now, originally a Mashiach, it wasn't even really called a Mashiach. It was really someone who was a branch from the house of David, who would be a political champion of the people and basically throw off the yoke of those who oppressed Israel. Political freedom and independence for Israel. Zerubbabel, who leads the people back. After Cyrus says they could go back in 539, 538. Remember, the temple was destroyed in 586, and then they go to Babylon. Cyrus says 539, 538, you could go back to Judea. He leads a small contingent back. He's from the house of David and appears to be acting as some sort of messianic figure. But over time, what happens, particularly once we get a little later on back to this Hasmonean or Maccabean period, 168 BCE, and remember here, the bigger numbers are earlier in history. We have 586, and then it goes down to 168. So we're going 586 is first, and 168. It's just, I know when we go BC, you have to keep that in mind. So what happens here is this idea really develops that is not just a Messiah, Mashiach, which means an anointed one is going to come. This anointed one is going to free Israel. And not only that, he's going to bring God's kingdom to this world, some sort of supernatural end to history. Now, we already have statements in Isaiah much earlier on during the first temple period. This is again before 586, about everybody getting along, all the nations worshiping the God of Israel. So we have some idea already of something really special will happen in Acharit Hayamim, which means the end of days. People are going along. I always mix up the animals, the lion and the wolf and the lion, whatever. You get the point. And nobody's going to experience war anymore. The Egyptians and the Assyrians, who are enemies of Israel, are even going to worship the God of Israel. So we have all these ideas of people getting along, but then during the latter second temple period, we really have this idea of, in some sense or another, it's going to be an end of history, which is going to mean some sort of resurrection of the dead as well. Now, when we talk about resurrection of the dead, this idea still has to develop a lot more. And interestingly enough, if you look at the Talmud and then the Rishonim, I'm talking about Maimonides and Nachmanides here, they have somewhat different views of what some sort of messianic era and resurrection of the dead will look like. Nachmanides takes, and that's what the end, Nachmanides, or the Ramban, takes more of a supernatural point of view, where people are going to be resurrected and everybody's going to live a good, very comfortable life. He's more of the mystical one. He's a little bit more mystically inclined. We have the Ramban or Maimonides, who's an Aristotelian rationalist. He's not as much into the mysticism. Now, he does believe in a resurrection of the dead, even though some argue perhaps that it was really his later students who put it in, because by a certain point, the idea of resurrection of the dead becomes such an integral part of Jewish thought. They thought, in a sense, that they had to kind of cover him retroactively by putting that in his name. But let's just say he's the one who actually puts in this idea about resurrection of the dead, like we see in the 13 principles at the end of the Shachrit service we have. So his resurrection of the dead is different than Nachmanides. Nachmanides, the ultimate is to be resurrected, living in a messianic era in the world. Maimonides says, no, what's going to happen after you're resurrected? You're going to die again. Why? Because it's better to be free of your klipa, your outer body, your shell, and instead have your soul be free to bask in the wisdom of God. This is really that Aristotelian influence, where the best thing to do is really be engaged in constant wisdom. And what's the best form of wisdom? God is the ultimate form of wisdom. So you could circle back now and say, well, wait a minute. Why would he even bother saying that people are going to, he or his students, whoever it is, actually says that to resurrect people in the first place? He just says once you die, you should be with God and basking in his wisdom. So the point is, we want to show that God has the ability to resurrect. And we actually, there's a nod to that in the second blessing of the Midah. Team. We are faithful to you who's able to give life to the dead. Now, it's an interesting phrase here. We're not praising God for giving life to the dead in this bracha, the second bracha of the Midah. We're saying we are faithful that this is something you will do because we haven't seen it yet. Unlike other bracha where we praise God, as God is doing things in real time. Baruch atah Hashem Magen Avraham. Blessed be God who shields Abraham. Here it's something we want to see in the future. And of course, it's put in the second paragraph of the Amidah because it's Gevurot, it's God's might. Only God has the power to resurrect the dead. And we also have the Mashiv Haruach HaMerid HaGeshem, talking about the rain for the winter season in Israel. That's in there too in the same paragraph, because human fertility and fertility of the soil and life and death and resurrection in the ancient mind are all basically part of the same larger picture. So the Rambam here, so as I said, the Rambam is talking about basically shedding your klipa, your shell, and going back to God and basking in God's wisdom. So there's a distinction in terminology here. When Rambam talks about olam haba, he's really talking about being with God after you've shed your body, perhaps you've been resurrected, and then you've gone back to God. And the Ramban Nachmanides talks about olam haba is when you're resurrected in this world. But until you're resurrected in this world, you die. And let's say you're in, so we'll say it in English, heaven is an easy term to use. That he refers to as Gan Eden. He refers to as paradise. And we see in the rabbinic mind, there's a lot of back and forth, by the way, between Gan Eden, olam haba. They're used interchangeably. We refer to Shabbat as me'ein olam haba, a taste of the world to come. That's what Shabbos is supposed to be. But what is a taste of world to come? Well, in the rabbinic mind, it's basically, if you really look at it closely, the idea is we really get to return back to the Garden of Eden. In other words, that space between humanity and God, which was caused by Adam and Chava, Adam and Eve eating the forbidden fruit, and then Eve, I think even more importantly, lying about it. I think that they only get kicked out really after they lie about it, quite honestly. But there's a distance between God and humanity. In fact, the Talmud in Hagigah says that until that sin, Adam reached from the world below to the skies above. And the point is not to tell us he would have made a great center in the NBA. He was really tall. It's to show us that there's now a disconnect between God and humanity, and that eventually will be breached. And that's going to be like an eternal Shabbat, a return to the Garden of Eden, or the world to come, all interchangeable terms. Okay. So this develops, and I'm just summing up. There's a lot more we could say about this rabbinic period, but the Rambam and Ramban are really the two most notable ones. But we also have now a third stage, which really develops a Kabbalistic or mystical approach here. And we really get, and I say this as somebody who's always much more attracted to the rational side of Judaism than the mystical side. But after reading this book, I really saw something which was very, it was a book about life after death by Rabbi Simcha Raphael Paul, Jewish Views of the Afterlife. I recommend the book. It really got my attention. And some of these mystical views are at least quite fascinating. So we have mystical views about Gilgul Neshama, which is reincarnation. Okay, so reincarnation is somewhat similar and somewhat different to a near-death experience. He talks about these near-death experiences, and if you've ever read about any near-death experiences, a lot of people have a similar type of experience. The experience is basically they're about to die. Sometimes they hear the doctors in the hospital says the person is gone, there's nothing we can do. and then they envision themselves standing at a tunnel, a long tunnel, and they're not sure if they should go into the tunnel or not. And then what happens usually is a loved one of some sort comes and says to them, well, you still have work down in the world below. It's not quite time. I'll see you later. Go back and finish your work below. So really the idea of Gilgul Neshama picks up on that concept. And this idea of reincarnation here is you're sent back. The difference is instead of being sent back in your own body, like in a near-death experience, you're sent back in somebody else's body. So like in the first life, you were Mr. X. Now you could be Mr. or Mrs. Y or whoever it is, and you're not necessarily cognizant of that. Now, I remember in graduate school, I have a master's in human resource development. We were taking a psychology class, and the teacher said, he said, don't get freaked out, everyone. But as part of my treatment, sometimes what I do is I hypnotize people and try to take them back to past life experiences. And what he was saying is it's irrelevant whether or not he really believes a past life experience is true. What he did find is that when people really believe they lived in a past life, sometimes uncovering what they think happened to them in a past life really can help them in this life. The example he gave was he took a guy back to a past life, an alleged past life experience, and the guy believed he was a Civil War soldier and had some horrible experience with blood, and that helped him get over a phobia about being around blood. So again, regardless of whether or not we really believe in this, if someone, it could help someone up here in their head. So that's the basic idea of Gilgul Neshama. But the Zohar and the Tikkun Zohar, when talking about this, have an interesting point of view. They base, and I'm going to make this concise because it's confusing and it's wordy. But basically, what they're saying is until you've completed all the mitzvot that you're capable of doing in this world, and remember, nobody is capable of doing all 600. Let me, if I'll throw it out. If you could unmute yourself. Why is nobody capable of doing all 613 mitzvot? Give myself a water break while someone answers.
The Beit Mikdash doesn't exist.
All right, good answer. That's one of the answers, Molly. You have no Beit HaMikdash, so you can't do all the mitzvot revolving around Korbanot in the Beit HaMikdash, the temple.
Well, there are also positive mitzvot and negative mitzvot. Some of them apply to us, while others don't.
Okay, so are you a Kohen, a Levite, a Yisrael, again, revolving around the Beit HaMikdash? Some are only for men, some are only for women. So no one's going to perform all 613 mitzvot. But the idea in the Tikkun Zohar, which means remedies, is that you keep getting sent back over and over again to this world until you could, every mitzvah that you're able to do, you're able to perform. So you get second chance and third chance and fourth chance, time and time again, until you can get it right. So in that sense, it's like a self-improvement type of point of view, which is a more rational type of person I really related to very well. Where obviously we're not going to sit around and say, well, I can't wait until I'm resurrected so I could get what I messed up wrong the first time around. But what we're supposed to, and we should be doing this anyway over the high holidays, the Yamim Narayim, is we should be looking at our deeds and say, well, I could have done this better last year, or this I did really well. So what I did really well, of course, I want to keep doing, and where I need improvement, I want to keep improving. It's just a Zohar takes it from life to life. And then finally, after you've done all the mitzvot that you humanly are capable of doing, at that point, your neshama, your soul, is able to shed its klipa, its outer body, and it's really ready at this point to join with God and basically dwell with God, kind of like this Rambam point of view that the ultimate is basking in God's wisdom. So I do see there are questions, so I will take them in a minute. Let me just finish on my my train of thought, and then I'll look at the questions in the chat room. So a couple other funky type of ideas we see in the Zohar. So one of the ideas is that instead of a regular Gehenna being sent to a purgatory of some point, and we'll talk about purgatory in a minute, but instead of being sent to a purgatory in some sort of never type of world, people's purgatory may be they're actually resurrected as an animal for living if you're a Russia, a really bad guy, you'd have to be resurrected as an animal. I don't know, a fly or, an animal people don't maybe treat particularly well in particular. So that is one possible point of view. And another idea is even tzaddikim, even the most righteous people may be resurrected. Now, why would the most righteous people be resurrected? You say, certainly those people would take the express elevator right up to Olam Haba. Why would they need to be resurrected again? So the suggestion that the mystics make is they need to be not need to, but they're being resurrected again to do favors, to help out other people. It's an ibor, it's called. It's like somebody else becomes pregnant with the soul of a tzaddik, a righteous person, so that righteous person could help them in a certain situation. So one of the examples given is Nadav and Avihu. If you remember, Nadav and Avihu were Aharon or Aaron's two eldest sons, and they died for bringing an unauthorized offering to the Mishkan, the tabernacle, as it was being inaugurated in the wilderness, and God consumed them with a holy fire. He killed them for this act. Now, we're never explicitly given a reason for why God kills them for bringing this act. Moshe actually, this is a bit of an aside, but nevertheless is fascinating. It shows us how difficult pastoral work can be. Moshe Rabbeinu, who is the greatest rabbi, the greatest teacher of all time, what does he say to Aharon when Aharon is looking at his two sons dead and just as an absolute poor guy is an absolute shell shock, doesn't know what to do? He basically says to Aharon, well, the reason why God took them is they were so holy, God just needed to take them immediately back to heaven with him. And what's Aharon's response? Very famous 2 words in Hebrew. Vayidom, I see some of you mouthing it, Vayidom Aharon. Aharon was silent. He didn't know what to say. So what are we seeing? What are we seeing here? We're seeing when somebody suffers a tragedy, a loss, human tendency is we want to come up with something pithy, the right words, just to make it better, make them feel better. But at times there just are no words. And really the best thing you can do is just not say anything and just kind of sit there and let them know your friend is here to help in any way, but not try to say anything. And we see even Moshe Rabbeinu accidentally made that mistake. By the way, we see it later on in Sefer Eov, the book of Job as well, where Job suffers. Most of you probably know the story where he loses his family and his wealth and his life is falling apart. And first his friends come and first they get it right, actually. They come, they basically sit shiva with him. They just come and they're holding his hand, comforting him. And then afterwards they say, well, Eov, God is all powerful and he's righteous, yet this evil happened to you. Well, if God is righteous and all powerful, let it happen to you. Must be somebody's fault, must be your fault. And they inadvertently wind up blaming the victim, which is always a danger we have when we try to read God's mind and figure out why these bad things happen. Of course, Eov is angry and he argues with God. And the answer basically is there are certain things which are beyond human knowledge. That's basically, but God basically gave that answer to Moshe earlier on too, after the golden calf incident. So the message of Sefer Eov, the book of Eov, there's 2 messages. One is the why do good things happen to bad people, the Kushner book. Obviously, that's a later work, but it's asking that question. But Eov is really asking another question as well, which people often miss. And the question is, should we continue to serve God even though we may not necessarily be rewarded in this world? Here we have this righteous man who's doing everything he's supposed to, yet a calamity hits him. And the answer is yes, you serve God even though you're not necessarily going to be rewarded in this world. But you people being people need something to keep them inspired. So that's where you get this idea that we spoke about, which really developed during the Maccabean revolt against the Greeks, that if you're not rewarded in this world, you'll be rewarded in the next world. So you have, so back to, so we're talking about the Ibor, and then although we have the Dibik, I'm not even sure if I'm pronouncing it right, the Yiddish word, that's more of the malicious version of when your body gets impregnated with somebody else's soul. And this is a kind of like a folklore type of idea as well. Oh, one thing I did want to add about resurrection and getting it right the second time. I think the best example, there's multiple ones, but the best example I think is the one of Shaul and Agag, the Amalekite king. One of the reasons why originally God isn't talking to Shaul or Saul anymore is he's supposed to kill Agag, the Amalekite king. He's supposed to wipe out all the Amalekites, and he doesn't kill them. He defeats the Amalekites, but he fails to completely wipe out the Amalekites. Now, historians suggest the reason he may not have killed the Amalekite king was a form of professional courtesy. One king wouldn't kill another even if he defeat him in combat. So he doesn't kill him, and then Shmuel or Samuel shows up and says, well, what's this guy doing over here? He's supposed to be dead. And Shaul fails to kill him. And so at that point, I believe this is the second time, basically, actually, Samuel reads him the riot act and says, because you failed to keep God's command, God will take the kingdom away from you. And this is basically when Saul falls out of touch with God. But if we look later on in the Purim story, we're told that Mordecai, even though he's actually the first person called a Jew, Ish Yehudi, he's a Jewish man. He's not really Jewish in the sense he's not from the tribe of Judah. He's from the tribe of Benjamin. He's from the tribe of Benjamin. So he's from the tribe of Benjamin. So the rabbis say this is actually the reincarnated Shaul or Saul, and Haman, an Amalekite, the rabbis say, is the reincarnated Agag. So what's the point here? The point is that Saul, this time reincarnated as Mordecai, is able to do what he was supposed to do the first time around and kill Agag, who is in the body of Haman. All right. So back to, I'm going to tie this a little more into directly what I'm going to talk more about. Kol Nidre is this idea that perhaps we do see loved ones again in the next world. So often we have things which are unsaid to loved ones. I remember hearing the example of, I don't even know if it's a true story or not. Probably not, but it makes the point very well, where a man comes to a rabbi and says, Rabbi, I really miss my wife. I loved her so much. I really, really miss her. And the rabbi says, well, I see you really loved your wife. And he says, yes. And once I even almost told her I loved her. So the point is often unsaid things. And I could speak from personal experience sometimes that speaking to a dearly departed loved one at a grave, even if you say this is really a bunch of Narishkeit, I don't believe in life after death, or you're kind of unsure about it, you're on the fence, or can our dearly departed loved ones really hear us or not? Even if you believe it's total Narishkeit, articulating it, particularly going to a grave, really can be very therapeutic and helpful. You really feel like you've said what you've needed to say. Now, of course, the Zohar takes this a lot further. It actually says that by patching up a relationship with a dearly departed loved one, you may help them let go of their anger. And this may actually help them go from Gehenna, some sort of purgatory, into Olam Haba, the world of heaven, or they believe in the 7 levels, if they're at the first level of heaven, helping them to let go of this anger they have towards you by patching up the relationships, by speaking to them, may help them ascend even higher and higher into the heavens. So, by the way, people always say, what is the Jewish view of Gehenna and the world to come? We've spoken a little bit about the world to come, at least the Rambam's view about basking in God's glory. Gehenna has all these different fiery and ash, which is motifs in this. This isn't mysticism, not in the Torah itself, which is obviously later on where the view of hell comes from. But I think the best, at least homiletically, the best way of looking at Gehenna was put once. It was a rabbi in Israel, I think, said it when I was studying there. He said, you have to watch a movie of what your life could have been. So that really helps during this time of the year when we're trying to review what our life should be, and saying to ourselves, okay, the movie may be in progress, but I could still make cuts. I could still make edits. The end of the story still hasn't been written. So I still have this ability now when I'm here. I don't have to worry about making up with my loved ones after I'm gone and they're speaking to me. You could try to do as much as you can now, which is obviously much easier. All right. So let me go into Scott. Did you want to go read some, pick out some questions from the chat for me?
Okay. I'm just going to go back up to the top.
Okay.
Let's go with Mish Morrison for now. When the
Okay.
Torah is forbidden witchcraft, Oven, Yidon, right? It doesn't
Right.
seem to say that these are not legitimate in achieving some kind of communication with the dead, rather that we are too rely on our prophets. Why do you think the Torah is not more empathetic from a rationalist perspective and simply say these are all falsehoods that don't accomplish what they purport to do?
Okay, so that's a great question. That's part of a bigger question. Why is it that the Torah doesn't deny other gods? It says, don't have any other gods lefanai, before me. So Yehezkel Kaufman, he's a great biblical scholar, his answer is that basically this is a poetic way of talking. Basically, who is like you among the gods? We're not giving legitimacy to other gods, which this is simply a poetic way of talking, and it may be also reflecting the point of view that the people are living there. Remember, when they go into Canaan, they're surrounded by other people who really believe this is like a legitimate form of medicine or science communicating with people. And Bnei Israel in their infant stage, in the nation stage, is going to be tested. For instance, they're going to go into the land of Canaan. And guess what? It may not always rain during the winter. Go to Israel nowadays during the rainy season. Sometimes it rains, and sometimes if you're a tourist, it's great. You're walking around in a t-shirt at 65 degrees, but it's not really good for the overall picture. So if you're an ancient Israelite, without the benefit of our hindsight, looking back later, and it's all written, by the way, mocking idolatry is supposed to be very funny. Like, how could these people be so stupid and believe in idols and worship false gods? But if you look at them in their mindset, what are they going to see? We have this God who's still relatively new to us. He took us out of Egypt. He took our forefathers there. But we're now in this land of Canaan. It hasn't rained for a while. And if it hasn't rained for a while, these Canaanites have been there a long time. Maybe we should try to do some of their rituals. Were often basically these like reenactments of Baal and Anat, these Canaanite gods mating in the heavens, basically. Maybe we should do the rituals the Canaanites are doing, which seems to have worked for them, and it will work for us too. This was called syncretic religious practice, which simply meant it was acceptable to fuse different religious traditions together. So in the same vein, when they were looking at the Torah is basically acknowledging that your neighbors think this is real. You guys, even for a time period, may think this. We're not going to accept it, but still may legitimately work. That's one point of view. Another point of view is not a religious point of view, but like an academic might tell you, for instance, that during this time period, the people were still developing from into a monotheistic people, and it took a long time. And we see historically the reality, regardless of whenever or not it became, in theory, it became a monotheistic religion. It took a long time till it really becomes truly a monotheistic religion. This is the fight during the entire First Temple period, constant battles against idolatry. And it's only really in the early Second Temple period that idolatry seems to disappear. And scholars really aren't exactly sure why, by the way. You would think Judaism would have ended with the destruction of the First Temple, because the temple had been destroyed. You would expect the Jews to say, not only are the Babylonian gods like Marduk real, but they're stronger. expect them to get taken off into Babylon and basically assimilate, and that would be the end of the whole thing. Instead, they're able to keep their identity. They come back to Judah, it's being called at that time, under Persian authority. And as the Talmud tells us, the Yetzer Hara, that taiva, that inclination to commit idolatry, God removed from the people. So that's a spiritual answer for why at this point monotheism wins. Historically speaking, historians would give you all sorts of different type of answers. But that was a long-winded way of answering Mitch's question. Okay, what else do we have?
Rabbi Sussman asks, what do you make of people who say that deceased relatives appear to them?
I mean, again, mystically, that kind of fits in with. I don't know. I mean, this is really more of like near-death experiences, maybe this folk type of law. In my readings, and listen, myself, I'm hardly an expert in the subject. I read enough, I thought, to make a really good Yom Kippur talk about it, but I didn't really see very much about people really believing that their dead relatives were here in this world reappearing to them. What I did come across in one of these Zohar vignettes in the Zohar was instead of having a relative usher you into this tunnel, getting ready to go into, and this is where you're either going to go to heaven or be sent back to do whatever you have to do down below. And one of the some of these experiences, sometimes it's a great rabbi. I think one of them was Rabban Yochanan ben Zakkai, who was a great rabbi during the right after the temple was destroyed. But it's an interesting question, worth looking into a little more. Jerry?
In my years as a rabbi, I've come across, I'd say, at least a half a dozen people, random members of our synagogue, who felt that a dead relative appeared to them, and the what they report is really very similar. It usually within a month of the person passing away, they either see, hear, or feel the presence of the person who passed away, and the person who passed away communicates to them that everything's okay and they shouldn't worry or whatever. And these are people who over a long period of time, who don't know each other, have no contact with each other, and yet they report something very, very similar.
It's interesting is similar, like these near-death experiences are often with the relative, and it's always this light and God is on the other side. And by the way, in the Zohar, it talks about, instead of a light, it talks about a Nahad Dinor, a river of light. So, and also the Tibetan book of, I forgot the name of it, the Bavardo or something. Very interesting, like different cultures have all these very different type of, similar type of experiences, I should say. I also want to comment about what Rabbi Sussman said about a month later appearing, because according to Kabbalah, you have chibat hakever after someone dies, particularly someone who's not a total tzaddik. We're talking about someone who's a benoni, a middle of the road type of person, some good, some bad, or maybe, or somebody who's a rasha, a wicked person, is instead of going right up to heaven in the express train, your soul is tormented and confused. You're not really sure where your soul belongs. It goes from the grave back home to the Shiva house to see people sitting Shiva for him or her, then back to the grave. And eventually, and this is in the Talmud itself, this idea develops that mourning for someone could actually help free them. Who was a Rabbi Judah or someone, I forgot, somewhere in Shabbat, page 152 or something like that. It talks about how I think the story was somebody didn't have anyone to mourn for them, and then one of the rabbis organized a minyan at the grave, and then a bit later on, the guy's spirit appears and says, "Oh, thank you, you've let me ascend to heaven," something along those lines. And the very idea, and I know a lot of you know this, the very idea of saying Kaddish, really, it developed very incrementally over a long period of time. And if my memory is correct from looking at this a couple years ago, the idea of saying Kaddish as saying it really for the deceased is really a post-Talmudic idea. Am I correct about that, my fellow rabbis? I believe it's I mean, the idea of saying Kaddish is clearly an ancient tradition, and it really the Kaddish really would demarcate different breakpoints in the service. Like you have a Chatzi Kaddish after you finish Psuke de Zimra in the morning in Shachrit, and before you go into the main service at the Borchu, you have a Chatzi Kaddish. So then you had this Kaddish at the end, which became associated with mourning. And this is really a story that's found in the Talmud as well as in other Midrashim, which is Rabbi Akiva comes along this dead soul who's in absolute torment. And apparently the guy's lived a horrible life and he knows it. But Rabbi Akiva says, is there anything I could do to help to move you up to Olam Haba, get you out of this tormented Gehenna-like state you're in? And it turns out that the guy had a son. So Rabbi Akiva taught the son how to say Kaddish. And the act of this guy saying Kaddish, originally, it was Motzei Shabbat, originally Motzei Shabbat at the Ma'ariv service, was enough eventually to free this evil, tormented soul to go up to heaven. So the idea is performing, when you perform mitzvot, particularly children perform mitzvot, it helps their deceased gain further merit. So we talk about saying Kaddish for them or saying Tehillim, Psalms on their behalf, giving the neshama an aliyah. In other words, getting them from Gehenna, out of Gehenna into Olam Haba, or even if they're in Olam Haba, that mystical concept about getting them from the first level to the second level to the third level. So I'm not sure how I got there, but that's how I got there. I think we have another question.
Yes, I'm just going, Harry Sealine wrote something in the chat earlier. He said, you said correctly that it's not possible for any individual to fulfill the 613 mitzvot for a whole variety of reasons, right? But why then, what is the meaning then of the Mishnah in Peah that says that learning Torah, studying, is equivalent to all of the mitzvot?
Okay, Talmud Torah Keneged Kulam. I just discussed this at my shul on Friday. I believe that's also in the in Shabbat as well. It's actually a Berkot HaTorah. So we have this famous saying, Talmud Torah Keneged Kulam. So learning Torah is equivalent to all these other mitzvot which are listed. So the mitzvot which are listed are mitzvot, at least in the version in Shabbat, are mitzvot you can double dip in. What I mean by double dip in is when you perform these mitzvot, you're rewarded in this world, and then again in the world to come. You're rewarded twice for the same mitzvah. So some of the mitzvot are Bikor holy and visiting the sick. I think Haknach Zorchim, welcoming guests is one of them. Helping a bride and groom celebrate. What are some of the others? Being first to davening or study hall, I think maybe one of them as well. Anyone else?
Kibbud Avim.
Okay, kiva avim, respecting parents. Okay. Right. Oh, I'm sorry. What was that, Mitch?
Gemilut
Hasadim, just general acts of kindness. So
Bikor
what is
Cholim?
Bikor Cholim? Thank you, Molly. Molly's a chaplain. Yeah, so visiting the sick, very important mitzvah. So this is the example I always like to give. So let's say I'm in my office and I'm studying this great piece of Torah, a piece of Talmud, whatever it may be, and I get a call from the hospital and they say, Rabbi, someone's in the hospital. They really need to see you. They're upset. Whatever it is. And I say, well, I'm sorry, I'm studying this great piece of Torah, Talmud Torah, Keneged Kulam. Studying Torah is as great as the mitzvah of performing Bikor Cholim. Is that what is that the right response? Is that what I'm supposed to be learning? No, of course not. I'm going to sit there studying while somebody really is in need of help. I would hope that anyone would get up and try to go help the person. So the point it's making is a very fundamental point. In other words, by studying Torah, you learn how you're supposed to live. What it's saying is all these mitzvot are rooted in the Torah, and by studying Torah, this is really your guidebook for how to live a good life. If you really understand what the Torah is saying, you'd realize, of course, you're going to close the book, go to the hospital, visit the person, and later on you reopen the Chumash or a piece of the tractate of Talmud, whatever it may be. And of course, misunderstood. Of course, it becomes dangerous, but I think you have to really almost try to misunderstand it. That's the good part of it. I think it's almost intuitive. You should know this is what's really expected of you. Okay. Good question from Harry. It's good to see you, by the way, Harry. Okay, Scott, what's the next question?
believe Molly was making a comment.
Okay.
She says that in my work as a chaplain, I have seen many times that if someone is dying, they reach their arms upward, and if they're able to communicate, I've been told that they are reaching for outstretched hand of a relative or friend who is coming to greet them.
Wow. So I've been told. So Molly, who tells you that?
Well, sometimes if a person is coherent enough,
Really?
they actually say the name of the person. They reach their arm out as if someone is extending their arm, and it's always up towards the ceiling. They may say the name of the person they're seeing who's coming to greet them. Now, whether you believe it or not, we actually have no way to explain it. So my feeling is it's possible. And when I'm in the presence of someone in that situation, I validate it for them. And I try to get them to be comfortable with that. If they say so-and-so is coming, I say, oh, that's wonderful. And reach out, and they do. It's a very amazing thing.
Of course, as a pastorally, you want to do anything at that point to comfort the person in their last moments. Now, you did something else I am going to talk about on Kol Nidre, so I'll apologize to my congregants. I'm going to have to hear this, hear some of this again. But there is a story from researcher Elizabeth Kolber Ross, who studied near-death experiences at length, and she talks about a story about a man witnesses this hit and run. He runs over to help the woman who's been severely injured, but there's nothing he could do. She basically dies. She dies in his arms, and as she's dying, he says, "Is there anything I can do?" Kind of like at the last moment, anything I could. And she says, "Tell my mom I'm okay. I'm now with dad." So he was so moved by this, he drove hundreds of miles to deliver this message directly to the woman's mother. This woman had obviously died. And it turned out that just minutes before this woman was killed in a fatal accident, her father had died of a coronary. This was before cell phones. So there's no way she could have, at least from our knowledge, there's no way she could have known her father had just died. He seems to have been certainly not at death's door. Then her soul seems to be leaving in those last moments, suddenly she has some sort of knowledge her father is already there waiting for her. So it's even for a skeptic, at least it makes you scratch your head and say, well, maybe there is something more than just strictly rational type of thoughts here. Thank you, Molly. I think Harry wrote another question. Didn't Rabbi Akiva get condemned? Condemned man sent to say Borhu. I believe that was part of the act as well, by the way. My memory is correct. He basically is leading Mariv, Motzei Shabbat, if my memory is correct, which I think included, I'm pretty sure did include Borhu as well as Kaddish.
Okay. If I may interject, Noah Gradovsky here, and apologies for being a disembodied voice. My recollection is that the original text was Baruchu, and that some of the texts that mention Rabbi Akiva and Kaddish probably are emendations of that text after Kaddish becomes associated with prayers by orphans or by people who have in memory of people.
Okay, yeah, and as Rabbi Gradovsky points out there, I don't remember how many, but there was a lot of one is in the Talmud. There's a whole bunch of different versions of the similar story tweaked in a different way. So that would certainly make sense. Is particularly after Kaddish has become, at least the mourner's Kaddish is becoming more associated with mourners as opposed to a Kaddish denoting something else in the service. That would certainly make sense. Thank you, Rabbi Gradovsky. Okay. Any other questions?
I've seen in the Shulchan Aruch this idea that if you didn't have the opportunity to ask for forgiveness in life, you should go to the cemetery and ask for forgiveness in death. And that if you could bring like a minion with you, right? I feel like it's easier sometimes to ask for forgiveness than to forgive some of the loved ones who are no longer here, What about that? What about forgiving in your heart those who are no longer here? I think that could be harder in a lot of ways for some people.
I mean, it could be harder. Sometimes it could be harder, and sometimes just a passage of time makes it easier. Obviously, if the person is there and can apologize to you while they're still there, that certainly may make it easier to forgive them. And also you talked about sometimes if you feel like you have something to say and weren't able to do, you feel like you have to teshuva, but the person's no longer there. So I remember, I think that's maybe in Hilchot Teshuva as well in the Shulchan Aruch, but Rambam's Hilchot Teshuva. But yeah, I've heard that as well. That's I think the idea is, even though you can't ask the person directly, I mean, maybe they could hear you from the world above, but at least you're willing to in public, admit this, and at least first step of teshuva, admitting the sin, and then acknowledging that you've done something wrong. So that's certainly, thank you, Rabbi Kalmoff. That's very good.
I was going to ask about the idea of forgiving yourself. And we actually have experienced this in our own family, where we have a family member who lost a longtime spouse. And during COVID, it was really basically separated during that time until the very, very last moment when the person who eventually died was already out of it. And that person, the spouse, is still going through just enormous grieving. And a big chunk of it is, I know intellectually he understands that he couldn't be there, but emotionally he can't forgive himself.
Well, first of all, as who said it? I'm totally blanking out here, but people basically are emotional beings, not rational beings. So if that's the public speaking guy, I'm totally blanking out. This is really bad. The guy who wrote the book on public speaking.
Covey? Not
Dale
Covey.
Dale Carnegie.
Oh, Dale Carnegie?
Dale
Okay.
Carnegie points it out in his book. Basically, people, he's talking about how to win friends and influence people. He says, remember, people are basically emotional, not rational. So of course, that happens all the time. It's rationally you realize you're not at fault, but it's very hard to forgive yourself. So you reminded me of a story I shared years ago during a Rosh Hashanah sermon. It was from a book called The 5 Languages of Forgiveness by Gary Chapman. He's a Christian, he's an observant Christian and some sort of therapist as well, I think in the Midwest. So he was counseling this guy who was a kid who was in high school, and he got a girl pregnant. And this kid also came from an observant Christian family. He found out that she had an abortion, I think without ever consulting him, she had an abortion. But after the fact, when he found out, he was just devastated. And it was really ruining his life, basically. Instead of being kind of like a happy-go-lucky type of teenager, he became a very depressed teenager. So eventually what Gary Chapman did is he had him write a letter to himself saying that he would forgive himself and basically let him move on. He would allow himself to move on with the rest of his life. And he had this young man read it to himself in the mirror. And that basically, I think, verbalizing it, the articulation that, okay, I realize I messed up, but I still have a lot of life to live. And the best thing I could do is really take advantage of that. Excuse me, really help them get beyond it. So it's a very important thing to do, is to be able not only to forgive others or accept forgiveness, but also to forgive yourself, because not forgiving yourself often leads to depression, and instead of moving on, you get stuck there. So please forgive yourself as well. Okay, any other questions? So let me ask. So Scott, I'm happy. How long are we supposed to be? I see we're at 1 hour.
Perfect. We're at 1 hour.
Okay.
I want to thank everybody so much for being here this evening. Thank you to you, Rabbi Sachs, for this presentation.
My pleasure. Thank you.
You're a good neshama, and we appreciate you having you part of UTJ.
Thank you very much.
And your congregants are very lucky. And the nice thing about Rabbi Sachs is that all of his classes are online. So even if you are not located in Wilmington, you can still participate. So get on it. He's really wonderful, and his Torah is very accessible. So we really appreciate you. And we appreciate everybody for being here. Thank you so much. And I wish all of you a Shana Tova. And I want to also remind you again that UTJ, we currently have our membership drive. If you'd like to join UTJ, here is the link. To read some of what we're doing in UTJ, some of our updates from the past year, some of the reasons why you should join our organization. And we also have a webinar coming up on October 4th. I'm sending the registration link in the chat. Misora and Machloket. Thank you so much for being here. Rabbi Sussman, do you have something you want to say?
Yeah, the only thing I want to say is I again want to join everyone in thanking you for your really very interesting presentation, but also to say that this is a subject which could use more programs, more discussion, and more further insight.
Thank you very much, everybody. Shana Tova, Gemar Tov.
Shana Tova, Gemar Tov, everyone. Laila Tov.
Laila Tov.
Thank you.
Thank you.